Read my lips, Ukraine is fucked. And by the way, so is Europe. This statement, which is also the title of this video, does not belong to me. That's why I use quotation marks. It is the raw, diplomatic declaration of a high-ranking Ukrainian official given to The Economist. Remember, I'm telling you, February 12, 2025 will remain in history. Even if the official end of the war in Ukraine is recorded later, even if geopolitical realignments occur gradually over the coming years, do not forget that yesterday was the day that explicitly marked the beginning of the end. The beginning of what end? The end of the world? No, not in general. I don't want to be catastrophic. The world will move forward as it always has, but the world as we knew it until now, yes. And the period in history we have known as the American century is now over. Yesterday, we were once again reminded how much a great power's commitment and word are worth. And for the umpteenth time in history we refuse to learn, maybe it is just human nature to be naive, we saw once again how politics at this level is conducted, cynically over the heads of those involved, over the heads of allies. This is called Realpolitik. It's a concept I've discussed many times in my videos on similar topics, and for which I have been harshly criticized over time. Realpolitik, in simple terms, is a system of policies based on pragmatism rather than moral or ideological considerations. According to those who shaped this concept, it is the only type of politics practiced by great powers. Ethical principles. Those are for the weak, not for the strong, for suckers, not for tough guys. That's what Realpolitik teaches. It is an approach that relies on circumstances and practical factors without considering moral premises or ideological principles. For example, hey, you Ukrainians, if you want even a single bullet from us, go find some rare metals, because we need them for chips and batteries. But let's take a look at what exactly happened yesterday, and then we will analyze the implications. Two major things occurred a 1.5-hour phone call between Trump and Putin. Seriously, even my wife doesn't stay on the phone that long. Some sharp statements from US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth delivered in Brussels, in the heart of Europe. And keep in mind the symbolism of this location. His statements left little room for interpretation regarding the future. Speaking of symbolism, the meeting was no longer held at Ramstein, the great and famous American military base in Europe, a landmark of US involvement on the continent. Brussels, in the heart of Europe, meaning I am telling you straight to your face how things stand in your own house. But let's take things one step at a time. Let's start with Trump's chat with his idol, Vladimir Putin. So, how did this go? Something like ring ring. Hey buddy, how's it going? What's up, boss? Just here dealing with this war next door. Should we do something about Ukraine? Like, you take some land, we take the minerals, and we shake hands on it. Sound good? You know how much I love the word deal? Didn't I say I deliver peace in 24 hours? I keep my word. Hey, you talk to Zelensky. You're joking, right? I'll call him right after I hang up with you. I'll just inform him of our decision. Got it. You too, buddy. Hey, should we meet up? Yeah, you come to Moscow or I come to Washington. You know what, let's both visit each other so no one doubts we're pals. Pals for real. That sounds great. Talk soon. Bye. That's about how it must have gone, because out of nowhere the news of discussion exploded, proudly announced by Trump himself. He wrote on Truth Social, I just had a long, very long, actually an hour and a half, and very productive conversation with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Productive indeed, rare minerals to us, land grabs to them. The way he phrased it, President Vladimir Putin of Russia, sounds almost like Peter the Great of Russia. He continued we spoke about the strong ties between our nations and the great benefits we will have by working together in the future. Sounds like pure love, doesn't it? But here comes the best part though. President Putin even used my powerful campaign motto, common sense, referring to the establishment of peace in Ukraine. What? In what universe does common sense apply here? Russia invaded Ukraine and turned part of it into rubble. Trump continues, we agreed to start negotiations immediately. We will begin, note the we, by informing President Zelensky of Ukraine about this conversation, which I will do right now. exactly what I just joked about earlier. I'll call him and inform him of what we decided. Ring ring. Hey, Zelensky, grab a notebook. Here's what Putin and I agreed on. Wait, what about us? Did anyone ask for your opinion? Shut up and deal with it. Trump concluded. I thank President Putin for his time and for the effort in this call. Wow. Now, let's move on to the more serious and colder, but no less striking, statements made by US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in Brussels. Hegseth bluntly stating, "We must recognize that Ukraine's return to its pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic goal." A BAM! Pursuing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. In other words, the tens of thousands of Ukrainians who died in this war died for nothing. And this brings back that cynical remark from a year or two ago, America will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Hegseth's statement essentially cements the annexation of Crimea in 2014. He also reinforced the annexation of a significant part of Donbass. Another key point in Ukraine's accession to NATO is off the table for the foreseeable future. And by the way, that was always a fantasy, I know. Every nation has the right to self-determination and to choose its own alliances. But in the light of Realpolitik, this only happens in theory. In reality, great powers have no intention of respecting such principles, and I've been heavily criticized every time I pointed this out. For nearly 3 years now, this war has raged in the heart of Europe. It's terrifying how great powers play with people's lives and aspirations. In 2008, George W. Bush made promises in Bucharest that were never going to be kept. Promises to Ukraine and Georgia: don't give people false hopes if you know you can't fulfill them. Furthermore, Hegseth stated that America does not intend to guarantee even the peace it itself brokers under the very terms that it and Russia desire. This peace would have to be secured by the Europeans. And he heavily emphasized that maintaining peace, if a peace deal is even reached, will not involve a single American soldier. And here comes the apex, the climax of his statements yesterday in Brussels said, European or British peacekeeping troops will not be covered by NATO's Article 5 in case they are attacked. That means America will not step in to help based on the mutual defense guarantees outlined in NATO's founding treaty. So this is serious. And here, allow me to make an important side note. Serene and indifferent Europe should have seen this coming, yet once again, it is caught with its pants down. Europe is just as prepared for this scenario as we Romanians used to be for winter back when we actually had real winters. Every snowfall would catch the authorities unprepared. Even though it was December, freezing cold, and the sky was heavy with snow clouds, somehow we were always unprepared. The same goes for Europe. And what seems absolutely inadmissible and absurd to me is that one of the wealthiest regions in the world, and don't be fooled, the European Union really does have a GDP of around 17 trillion euros, not much lower than of the US or China with a population of 450 million people, is so weak and unstable militarily. For comparison, Russia's GDP is about 7 times smaller, and its population is more than 3 times smaller. Yet Europe has been relying on the American military umbrella for 80 years now. And these recent nationalist, sovereigntist movements in some European countries only make things worse. At the start of this week, Zelensky flat out said that Europe is incapable of offering Ukraine security guarantees without US involvement. I quoted, "Security guarantees without America are not real, and they are not guarantees. Humiliating. A decent peacekeeping force, according to analyst estimates, would require somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 European soldiers, which would still be nothing compared to the 600,000 Russia has on the ground right now. And Europe is stalling. Even that is seen as unfeasible." Quote, "Europe cannot deploy such a force at this moment," said a senior European official yesterday. "We cannot pressure America to commit troops either. So we must accept the situation and see what we can do." End quote. Well, from that it sounds like we can do pretty much nothing. Yet Europeans are still surprised that Trump is making a separate peace deal with Putin on terms decided exclusively by the two of them over the heads of Europe and Ukraine. But why are you surprised, boss? What was it that Realpolitik said? The reality on the ground is what matters, not the ethics or principles written in books. And, of course, given these circumstances, another question arises: what does NATO even mean anymore? And what relevance does the alliance have in this context? This question concerns us directly as well. Yesterday, in formal terms, Hexat reaffirmed US commitment to NATO, but something fundamental has changed. Let's rewind history a bit. America's interventions won 2 world wars, which started in Europe. Then, the Americans guaranteed this continent's freedom against the Soviet threat. But Trump has made it clear, not just in last year's election campaign but also during his first term, that under his leadership, America will no longer defend NATO members who do not defend themselves. And even though many believe history began the moment they were born, this is nothing new. Trump is just returning to the logic used by many previous US presidents who were reluctant to engage in foreign entanglements. Yesterday, he said, "We have this little thing called an ocean between us." Let's not forget how much pressure the British and the French exerted in the early 1940s to convince America to enter the war and come to Europe's aid. At that time, the overwhelming majority of Americans were against getting involved. It took a direct attack on the US by Japan at Pearl Harbor to change that. Fast forward to today, it was as clear as daylight that a second Trump administration would impose new demands on Europe. This would mean difficult choices for governments that have preferred prosperity over defense. In fact, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte already said last month before the European Parliament that Europeans must allocate more money for defense, and his statement was quite unconventional for an official of his rank. He said, "If you don't, you might as well start learning Russian or move to New Zealand." That's what Rutte said. But Hexat's statement was even more shocking. He made official Trump's demand that NATO members spend 5% of their GDP on defense. And he explained why. From now on, the US will prioritize its growing confrontation with China and the security of its own borders over Europe. He bluntly stating, the US will no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship that encourages dependence. A translation: America has taken off the gloves and dropped the diplomatic niceties. They're now saying it straight. Guys, we don't give a damn about you. We have bigger problems. China, our borders, internal affairs, etc. So, deal with Putin and Ukraine on your own. Excuse my language, but that is exactly what this means. And this American disengagement was evident even this morning as I browsed through the American press. I couldn't help but notice the complete lack of interest in this topic. They're busy with other issues: the economy, inflation, Trump's fights with the government, deportations, and so on. So Europe and Ukraine were nowhere to be found on the front pages. Because, as the saying goes, a shirt is closer to the skin than a coat. And whether we like it or not, whether Trump is crazy or not, this American attitude is a rational response to the dramatically changed global political realities. The generation of Americans who fought in World War II and understood the dangers of a power vacuum in Europe has long disappeared. The Cold War generation, those who still remember what it was like to confront the Soviet Union, are now at least 50 years old. Meanwhile, America's greatest competitor is no longer in Europe, it is in Asia. So it is legitimate for Trump to ask Key, why 80 years after the defeat of the Nazis is the Eurocontinent still unable to take care of its own defense? And he's right. Again, unfortunately for us, both American presidents and European leaders who have come and gone since the fall of the Berlin Wall have failed to seriously rethink NATO for the 21st century. Even worse, some of them recklessly made hollow promises, like the one in 2008 in Bucharest when they created false hopes for countries like Ukraine or Georgia. Countries that are now suffering immensely because of these dysfunctional policies, left at the mercy of an increasingly assertive and aggressive Russia. Speaking of that, now is a good time to discuss the outbreak and escalation of this war, which started 3 years ago, because, believe it or not, in less than 2 weeks we will reach February 24th, marking exactly 3 years since the invasion. What seemed unthinkable at the time, a full-scale war of this magnitude in the heart of Europe, suddenly became possible. But how did it happen? Why, I have read countless books, articles, reports, analysis and transcripts on this subject. And yet, 3 years later, we still find ourselves asking, what the hell happened? And I believe, above all else, that this war should have never happened, under no circumstances. As I have said in the past, and was criticized for it, it should have been avoided at all costs. And as I have also said before, paraphrasing a famous quotee, everyone knows when and how a war begins, but no one can ever know when and how it will end. Because once a war starts, it takes on a life of its own. It escapes any control. At the time of the outbreak of this devastating war, the President of the United States was an old man, completely stuck in the Cold War paradigm. Biden viewed everything through that lens, a career politician with decades in the American political system. Biden could not possibly see the situation from any other perspective. Because, as the saying goes, what you loved in your youth, you never forget in your old age. Born in 1942, Biden was already 20 years old at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the peak moment of Cold War tensions. So how on earth could anyone expect a president like him to evaluate the situation differently? It was, in a way, a perfect storm. A series of idiotic factors that led to one of the largest conflicts since World War II. War with huge geostrategic consequences, many of which we haven't even begun to feel yet. Then there were the irresponsible promises of NATO expansion, or let's not be so harsh. Not irresponsible, but rather narrow and unrealistic. Speaking of Realpolitik, the red lines drawn by Russia were repeatedly ignored, like in a sleepwalk toward disaster. It was obvious that at some point something would break. It was hard to imagine that Russia would tolerate and accept without reaction this NATO expansion in its own backyard. Or at least that's how Russia perceives it. But the problems didn't even start there. They began right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the way the West chose to deal with Russia, in how it treated and regarded them. And another thing I have said many times before, and again I was harshly criticized for it. Even after this war began, efforts to stop it were almost non-existent. Peace should have been pursued when it was still possible. But not only was peace never sought, more fuel was thrown on the fire from all sides. That's how the cynical expression came about, America will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. I also said from the start that time was on Putin's side, and indeed that's exactly what happened. He just had to wait for a shift in US leadership, and it happened. Hold on a bit until the tide turns again. Too few understood at the time how dangerously dependent this war was on American support. Now, as soon as the leadership changed, so did the fortunes of this war. And now we are looking at a massively unfavorable outcome for Ukraine, which is how conflicts with great powers have always been resolved. And looking back at the more recent past, this transatlantic alliance has now made itself vulnerable to the most transactional, nationalist US president since the late 19th century, and the first test of this new reality is Ukraine. Trump has stated that negotiations will begin immediately after his private conversation with Putin. A Putin who, until now, had been isolated by the West, but whom Trump now describes as a great partner, saying, "We will have tremendous benefits working together." So, Russia is no longer a pariah, and Zelensky, he wasn't even included in the discussion, even though up until now, he was at the center of all US efforts regarding this war. Hegseth was just as blunting, Ukraine cannot return to its previous borders. Ukraine cannot join NATO, and US troops will not be part of any peacekeeping force. Any peacekeeping force must be made of European and non-European troops. This force will not be covered by NATO's collective defense clause, meaning if Russia attacks them, the US will not intervene. So, yesterday was a great day for Putin, and many of Ukraine's aspirations were crushed. Hegseth shrugged and said, "We are simply promoting realism." And what do you know? He has a point. Because realistically speaking, no one truly believed Ukraine could ever return to its pre-2014 status. Then why was this war dragged on for so long? Here we return to what I said years ago about seeking peace, for which I was heavily criticized at the time. Ukraine has failed to reclaim its territory on the battlefield despite billions of dollars in Western aid. And as for Trump, who calls himself the master of negotiation, His conciliatory stance toward Russia yesterday has just stripped Ukraine of one of its last bargaining chips, a lever it could have used to extract concessions from his old friend Putin. Because, as things stand now, Trump has no problem with Russia keeping the spoils of its invasion. But this shouldn't come as a surprise, because just like Russia, Trump also believes that great powers have the right to expand their influence in their respective regions. This leads us directly to our problem, because we ourselves are in their region. I can't help but wonder, and God forbid I'm right. I really hope I'm wrong, but I can't shake feeling that yesterday was just the first public sign of some agreements that have existed for a while. Suspect that Trump doesn't report to us every single conversation he has with the Russians, and there are reasons to suspect that this isn't just about Ukraine, but about the entire region. No, not thinking about Russian tanks rolling through Eastern Europe like some people like to dramatize, even though some seem to forget, or pretend to forget, that this actually happened in Budapest in 1956 and in Prague in 1968, but I'm not talking about that kind of scenario. I'm thinking about a more subtle, quiet, but still very real surrender of influence. And once again, I say it loud and clear, the signs are there. Isn't it suspicious how quickly a certain candidate with obvious pro-Russian leanings has risen in certain local elections? Could that be a signal of an obscure behind-the-scenes agreement? Not talking about another Hungary or Czechoslovakia from the last century or Ukraine in this one, but about a tacit gradual shift, a soft surrender of influence. And other signs point in the same direction. For example, the announced withdrawal of American bases and troops from this part of Eastern Europe. For the past 30 years, this region was considered the spearhead of NATO's eastward expansion. But if there is no longer a confrontation, if all of America's attention and resources are now focused on the Pacific and China, then what's the point of keeping military deterrence here? And in this context, we come back to the problem of Europe. What does the European Union want? Does it even know what it wants? And let's be even more direct, will the European Union survive this crisis? Or will this crisis revive that old ugly West-East divide? Will the big, powerful countries in Western Europe, facing their own internal crises, still be willing to support their Eastern neighbors? Or will they see them as a burden and decide that the effort and risks are not worth it? Guys, these are legitimate questions. And the worst part is that our nation is completely unprepared for this situation. We are caught with our pants down, at a time of incredible political instability, with an interim president, with a divided parliament, with an incompetent, fragile, pathetic government, and with an unprecedented surge in extremist movements. And let's not forget it, if Russia gets rewarded with a favorable peace deal, this will create a disastrous precedent. Yesterday I was reading an interview with former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt, and he put it plainly: we are dealing with two massive egos who believe they can maneuver all the world's problems by themselves. And he made the gravest historical analogy possible: the appeasement policy of the United Kingdom toward Nazi Germany, the same policy that allowed the Germans to annex the Sudetenland for Europeans. This sounds like Munich, like two big leaders shaking hands for peace in our time, at the expense of some distant country they know little about. We all know how that movie ended. Bildt is right. What could happen now is something similar to the division of Germany after World War II, where the territory occupied by Russia remains under Russian control, while the rest of Ukraine, on the other side of a militarized border, might eventually remain a democracy, maybe. With a little luck, though I find that hard to believe, especially considering that Russia now has the upper hand on the battlefield. So maybe, just maybe, at some point, the western part of Ukraine will be allowed to join the European Union, just like West Germany became part of the Western world. But this time there will be no American troops guaranteeing freedom. And if this happens, it would be one of history's cruelest ironies. Imagine it, Putin, the man who watched with despair as the Soviet Union collapsed from his KGB post in Dresden, now using America's help to create a new East Germany in 21st century Europe, a new Iron Curtain, not of iron but of suffocating velvet, draped over Eastern Europe, because Russia has experience with both, with iron and with velvet,